So either yesterday or the day before, I did a reading of the last few pages that I had written in the book called 144. And prior to giving that reading, I had talked about the origin of that book and how it grows out of how it had grown out of some of an intersection of a number of concerns that I had and worked with in my art over time, and one of those concerns and areas of investigation was the work that I had done, regarding mental illness and the idea of madness and insanity as a social construct, and the way that this construct is reified through a kind of performative gesture on the part of the medical establishment. And both the performativity of reification and the social consequences of that performativity has been of interest to me in my work. From, I guess, the time that I started making art, probably before I was even aware of some of these words. If I look back to the work that I did as a child, I see the same concerns and interests. So in any case, part of it had grown out of that, and then it began as a reworking, as I had mentioned, of a David Anton poem called something like, a list of the delusions of the insane, what they are afraid of. And one of the things that interested me about that piece, well, a number of things, but that it sort of hides the fact that this was a list of essentially what were referred to as hysterical symptoms of women, So it grows out of this, basically misogynist psychiatric inventory of these hysterical fears, or the madness of women whose hysteria, the word itself, betrays the patriarchal investment in its ideology, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway, that whose fears grow out of this moral differentiation between men and women. So that wasn't really clear in the presentation of the piece. The origins have been made clear in more recent anthologizing of the work, although a specifically political thrust is still not provided for it. But in any case, I had responded to this piece with an iterative or list poem structured work called something like a list of misconceptions of the sane regarding the mad, what they misrecognize in them, or perhaps it was what they believe about them, or something like that. And it was a long list of ideas, right, from our culture that have very little, to do with knowledge of individuals, with whatever you want to call it. If you believe in the idea of insanity, then you can call it that, or if you like the more archaic term, you can call it madness. Or for me, individuals are always different, and then those differences get assigned values in the culture. And some of those values that are assigned to those differences take away the rights of those individuals. And that's what I call social construction. It's not that the differences themselves, don't exist, but it's that the meanings and the matters of those differences are truly what make a difference in the lives of those individuals. And that's true, for a number of different things, and even even non-normative things like gender. And then when I say non-normative, it's kind of like saying anagnorisis, a sort of double negative. But what I mean by non-normative is that, things that we accept as part of the human condition, which are also social constructions, right? But even those things like are socially defined and regulated by authority and cultural values attached to what I would call normative differences. Normative differences would be ideas of gender, ideas of race, which are differences in those categories aren't pathologized the way they are in categories of the mind or categories of the ableist body, and yet the distribution of power within those differences very much reflects differences of power in the non-normative distinctions. So all of that having been said, I was very much interested in this list and what doesn't get said about the list, that it begins in this idea of hysteria, and one could effectively say it's an attempt to justify the control of women's bodies and their ability to move across locuses in space and time, within patriarchy. So that appealed to me about addressing the list. And as I said, I would write, things like, this list of the beliefs of the sane would include things like and the they would refer to individuals, either that the society deems mad or have been recognized as such or institutionalized, that they have no rights, that they cannot think for themselves, that they are incapable of love, that they are violent, that they are prone to self-harm, that, and it would go on and on and on. So I had done, I had talked about the history of my response to David's List piece, and then I had speculated that Jerry's revision of Jerry Rothenberg's revision of David's piece may have grown out of his looking at my response to the piece, or he may have not been aware of my response. And I explained a little bit about why either one of those possibilities might be likely. And then I had sort of done talked about the history of that piece, and a little bit about its relationship to the suppression of women in psychiatry. And then, today on NPR, I often get up and look at the news, unfortunately, and I saw the article on the disintegration of women's rights concerning what they are allowed to do with their bodies in the United States, and of course, bodies and minds as well, but it's becoming more and more acceptable in our culture to regulate the lives of women. And this interested me because the piece that I read yesterday from the book of called 144 is essentially about the Taliban's suppression of women's rights and women's rights to travel, to teach, to learn, to control their own bodies, to own property, to make decisions, to have rights, and you know, I had thought, you know, that this is sort of a universal human rights issue that a lot of us here in the United States would feel like, sort of automatically register as an injustice. And then I see, this headline, and I wonder if that's really the case, meaning that do we in the United States anymore even believe in these principles of sort of universal rights and equality, among these various socially constructed, both normative and non-normative differences. And I'm beginning to question whether the assumption that I had regarding, any kind of shared, values on these issues is even there. Supreme Court upholds new Texas abortion law for now. And I guess maybe, to emphasize this, for now, and perform a sort of close reading of it. I mean, the irony of it, for now, and now representing the National Organization of Women, and I wonder, what does it have to do with time? For now, I haven't read the article yet. So they're withholding making a final determination. I don't know what that means. It's all extraordinarily disturbing. I mean, especially for an elder adult male who was raised by a single parent in the 70s, and I'm very much aware that of what her struggle was in patriarchy and the difficulties that she had, my mother raising a single child in what was, a pretty liberal zeitgeist at the time. And I can only imagine, like, the struggle and the terrorism of attempting to do that today. And the idea that, like, there would be something wrong with that when it is just a life, a part of a life and a way of living that isn't even chosen. And to address this issue of, like, if there's any moral issue involved in the raising of a child by a single parent, or choosing, whatever. But, the reason that I was raised by a single parent is because my father was violent. And if my mother hadn't divorced my father, if there hadn't been a right to divorce my father, I probably would have died, because he would have beaten me to death. So that's not a moral issue. That's just a life. That's just living a life, right? That's just doing what any good person would do to survive. And the same is true for issues of, choosing to have control over one's body and decisions in life that relate to having a child or not having a child. and that this sort of moral judgment is placed on it, and that what astounds me is this fabrication of a history against abortion on the part of this conservative minority that want to control women's lives, is that it never existed. There was historically, there never was an animus against abortion, and except when the medical institution and people wanted to take power away from women, midwives in particular, but this notion that the father owns the child and the woman doesn't have rights over that child, when in our sort of more open society, or what was once our more open society, we recognized that because the child belongs to the mother's body, that the child is essentially hers to determine, her course of her life with her child. And that this was something that again, that I not only believed, but like understood, from the time that I was very little, like just because of the nature of my life. So my experience was that women had to struggle against patriarchy to survive and to protect their children and to protect themselves. And so when I saw, this article on where our country is going, I thought I would return to that list, poem structure, and improvise some kind of piece that isn't part of the book called 144, but that addresses these fears, and I'll try to do something like that now. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to have a child. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right not to have a child. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to have a life. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to have a job. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to have a right. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to walk. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to speak. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to write. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to be presented in museums. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to be presented on stage. Some of them feared that patriarchy would sell their bodies and exploit their bodies for profit. Some of them feared that they would not be allowed by patriarchy to exploit their own bodies for profit. Some of them feared that patriarchy would misrepresent them in books. Some of them feared that patriarchy would misrepresent them in history. Some of them feared that patriarchy would misrepresent them in court. Some of them feared that patriarchy would misrepresent them in the afterlife. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to move. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to stay. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to own property. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to own books. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their right to speak. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their tongues. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their genitals. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their hair. Some of them feared that patriarchy would take away their graves. Some of them feared that patriarchy would.